There is a deal that has shaped the entire world economy for 50 years. Most people have never heard of it. It was made in secret. It was never formally announced. And it has been the invisible foundation beneath every oil transaction, every international trade deal, and every American military budget since 1974. It is called the petrodollar system, and right now, quietly, methodically, and deliberately, it is being dismantled. Today, we are going to examine what the petrodollar system actually is, how it was created, what it has meant for American power, and who is working to end it, and why. Because the consequences of what is happening right now will affect every person on this planet, whether they know about it or not. To understand what is being dismantled, you first need to understand what was built. The year is 1971. President Richard Nixon makes one of the most consequential financial decisions in modern history. On August 15, 1971, he closes the gold window, suspending the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. Until that moment, every U.S. dollar in circulation was technically backed by gold. Any country holding dollars could exchange them for physical gold held in American reserves at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Nixon ended that. The dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, its value backed not by gold, but by trust, by the full faith and credit of the United States government. The problem was immediate and obvious. If the dollar is not backed by gold, why would the rest of the world continue accepting and holding dollars? What would give the dollar its value? The answer came 3 years later, in 1974, and it came from the desert. U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon and his deputy Jerry Parsky traveled to Saudi Arabia and brokered a confidential agreement with Saudi officials. The existence of this agreement was not revealed to the public until 2016, when Bloomberg News filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. National Archives. The terms were straightforward. Saudi Arabia would invest its oil proceeds in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military aid, weapons, and security guarantees. By 1975, every major OPEC nation was trading oil in U.S. dollars. The petrodollar system was born. To understand why this deal was so powerful, you need to understand one simple fact. Every country in the world needs oil. To buy oil, you needed dollars. This created a permanent global demand for U.S. dollars that had nothing to do with confidence in the American economy. Countries that hated America still needed dollars. Countries that competed with America still needed dollars, because they all needed oil. The consequences for American power were staggering. First, America could print money without causing immediate inflation at home. The inflationary pressure was distributed globally rather than concentrated inside America. Second, America could run permanent trade deficits without consequences. Normal countries that spend more than they earn face currency collapse. America faced none of these constraints because the world always needed more dollars for oil transactions. Third, American financial institutions sat at the center of global trade. Every oil transaction processed through dollar-denominated systems, every international settlement cleared through American banks. The SWIFT financial messaging system operated in dollars. American financial sanctions therefore carried existential weight. Being cut off from dollar systems meant being cut off from global trade entirely. This was not accidental. It was the architecture of power. There was a second dimension to this system that made it even more powerful. When Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states sold their oil for dollars, they accumulated enormous quantities of dollars. They recycled them back into the American financial system. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds, funding American government spending. They invested in American financial markets, funding American corporations. They deposited dollars in American banks, which then lent those dollars globally, creating further dollar demand. This recycling mechanism meant that American consumers buying oil at a gas station were indirectly funding the U.S. government's ability to borrow cheaply. American Treasury bonds were the safe and liquid home for Gulf dollar surpluses, and Gulf demand for those bonds kept American borrowing costs low. It was a perpetual motion machine of financial power, and it worked for 50 years. The petrodollar system did not begin breaking overnight. The cracks have been developing for years, but they have been accelerating with remarkable speed since 2022. The first major crack came with the weaponization of the dollar. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The Western response included one of the most dramatic financial weapons ever deployed. America and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russian sovereign reserves held in Western financial institutions. This was unprecedented. Sovereign reserves, the savings of a nation-state, had always been considered sacrosanct under international law. The message sent to every non-Western government on Earth was immediate and alarming. Your dollar reserves are not safe from seizure. They can be frozen if you act in ways America disapproves of. Every country that had accumulated dollar reserves suddenly faced an uncomfortable question. How safe are our reserves really? The second crack was the rise of China. China is now the world's largest importer of oil. In October 2023, the first purchase of crude oil was settled in China's digital yuan, marking a historic departure from the dollar-only oil settlement system that had held since 1974. In November 2023, China and Saudi Arabia signed a currency swap agreement worth approximately $7 billion, allowing direct settlement between the yuan and the Saudi rial. The foundational premise of the petrodollar system had been broken. BRICS was originally an acronym for a group of major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. For years, it was dismissed by Western analysts as a talking shop. That dismissal is no longer credible. At the 2023 BRICS summit in Johannesburg, the bloc formally invited 6 new countries to join: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Argentina. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE officially became BRICS members on January 1, 2024. Saudi Arabia formally completed its membership in July 2025. The expanded BRICS bloc now represents approximately 45% of the world's population and 35% of global GDP measured by purchasing power parity, according to the House of Commons Library Research Briefing. More importantly, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung analysis shows that BRICS nations now account for more than 40% of global oil production and more than 36% of global gas production. The World Economic Forum analysis confirms that with Gulf energy producers inside BRICS, the bloc could control nearly half of oil production worldwide. The bloc has been actively discussing a new settlement currency for trade between member nations that would allow trade to bypass the dollar entirely. This is not a peripheral development. This is the most significant challenge to dollar supremacy since the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world's reserve currency in 1944. The shift away from the dollar is not just happening at the level of summit declarations and geopolitical announcements. It is happening in the real world of actual transactions. Russia and China now conduct more than 99% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan, rather than dollars, according to Russian Finance Minister Anton Silvanov, confirmed at the 11th Russia-China Financial Dialogue in Beijing. India has been purchasing Russian oil using alternative payment mechanisms outside the dollar system, with Indian refiners depositing rupees into special overseas bank accounts that are then converted to dirhams or yuan, according to Bloomberg reporting. Central banks around the world have been quietly reducing their dollar reserve holdings and increasing their gold holdings. According to the World Gold Council, central banks globally purchased 1,082 tons of gold in 2022, the highest level of net purchases since 1950, followed by 1,037 tons in 2023 and approximately 1,045 tons in 2024. 3 consecutive years above 1,000 tons is a pace unseen in modern times. Gold does not carry sanctions risk. Gold cannot be frozen by a foreign government. Gold is no one's liability. The flight to gold is a direct response to the weaponization of dollar reserves demonstrated by the Russian sanctions, according to the OMFIF analysis of IMF reserve data. According to IMF COFR data, the U.S. dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 2001 to approximately 57% by late 2025, a decline of nearly 14 percentage points over 2 decades. Countries are not making public announcements about reducing dollar dependence. They are simply doing it, quietly, systematically, transaction by transaction. The privileges America has enjoyed under the petrodollar system are so embedded in American economic life that most Americans have no idea they exist. The ability to run permanent deficits without currency collapse. The ability to print money without proportionate domestic inflation. The ability to borrow at lower interest rates than any other government on earth. The ability to impose financial sanctions that carry existential weight. All of these privileges depend on dollar dominance. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, even partially, the consequences for the American economy would be severe. American interest rates would rise as foreign demand for Treasury bonds falls. The American government would face genuine constraints on its borrowing for the first time in 50 years. American consumers would face higher prices as inflationary pressure currently absorbed globally concentrates domestically. American financial sanctions would lose much of their power as alternative settlement systems provide workarounds. As Russia's experience demonstrates, with 99% of its China trade now bypassing the dollar entirely. The American military, funded by the cheap borrowing enabled by petrodollar recycling, would face genuine budget constraints. This is not a small adjustment. This is a fundamental restructuring of the global financial order and America's place within it. That transition may already be underway. There is a dimension to this story that almost no one is discussing publicly. The petrodollar recycling system does not just fund the American government. Gulf sovereign wealth funds recycling petrodollars back into American markets have been among the largest investors in American technology and artificial intelligence companies. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund has invested billions into American technology companies. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth funds have taken significant stakes in AI infrastructure companies. The capital funding America's AI dominance has in significant part come from petrodollar recycling. If the petrodollar system weakens, if Gulf states accumulate fewer dollars from oil sales, the flow of recycled capital into American technology slows. The competition between America and China for AI dominance is in part a competition over which financial system will fund the next generation of technology development. The petrodollar and the AI race are connected in ways that almost no mainstream analysis acknowledges. At this point, a reasonable question is whether the dollar is simply finished as the world's reserve currency. The honest answer is more complicated than either dollar bulls or dollar bears typically acknowledge. The dollar retains extraordinary structural advantages. As of 2025, the US dollar still comprised approximately 57% of disclosed global foreign exchange reserves, far ahead of the euro at around 20%, and the Chinese renminbi at just over 2%. According to IMF COFER data. American financial markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. The yuan is constrained by China's capital controls and lack of full convertibility. A BRICS currency remains conceptual. What is more likely than a sudden dollar collapse is a gradual fragmentation of the global financial system. A world where the dollar remains dominant in Western trade and finance, but loses ground in Asian, African, and Middle Eastern trade corridors. The dollar does not need to collapse entirely for American power to diminish significantly. A dollar used in 57% of global reserves, rather than 71%, as the IMF data already shows, represents an enormous loss of financial leverage and economic privilege. That transition is not a future possibility. According to the data, it is already underway. The petrodollar system was built on a confidential agreement in 1974. For 50 years, it gave America privileges no empire in history had ever enjoyed. The ability to print the world's money, the ability to fund unlimited deficits, the ability to impose financial sanctions as weapons of war. That system is now under the most serious challenge it has ever faced, not from a military rival, not from a nuclear confrontation, but from a quiet, systematic, transaction-by-transaction movement away from dollar dependence by nations that have decided the risks of holding dollars outweigh the benefits. The process will not happen overnight. The dollar will not collapse next week. But the architecture of global financial power that has defined the world since 1974 is shifting, and most citizens of the countries most affected by that shift have no idea it is happening. That is what this channel exists to change. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to The Business Architect. Every week we examine the hidden financial mechanisms and power structures that shape the world most people never see.